Ricardo Rodriguez has ordered men to die for far less reasons than this. Less betrayal, less disrespect, less inconvenience. When the bullet enters his back, it isn't rage that finds him. It's disbelief. Men like Ricardo do not get shot in alleys. They give the orders from penthouses. People call him inevitable, the architect of fear, the man who turned whispers into funerals. Entire neighborhoods adjust their breathing when he moves. Tonight, he is crawling through garbage, through dirt, and his own blood. Rain turns the pavement black and slick. Blood spreads beneath him in diluted ribbons, sliding toward the gutter like it's eager to leave him behind. His fingers scrape concrete. His lungs refuse to fill. He knows who did this. Mateo, his cousin, his own blood, the same boy he once protected, the boy he loved. Ricardo lets his eyes close. He waits for footsteps. He waits for the mercy shot, for inevitability to correct itself. Instead, something warm touches his cheek. Something small and soft. He forces his eyes open. A little girl in a bright yellow raincoat is kneeling beside him, studying his face as if she's found a wounded animal instead of the most feared man in the city. She doesn't scream or runs. She leans closer, curls dripping rainwater onto his skin. "Don't be scared," she whispers gently. "You're safe now. My mommy helps people." Safe? No one has ever offered Ricardo Rodriguez safety. He has only ever been the storm. And as the word settles into him, heavier than the bullet lodged near his spine, a truth slices deeper than betrayal. If she believes he can be saved, then the monster she sees might not be the worst thing he's done. If this story already has you, you're not alone. Subscribe and hit the bell. New stories drop every week. Drop a comment below. Team Ricardo or Team Rosa? The alley smelled like rain and rot, and something metallic that Ricardo knew was himself. He had made it 11 feet from the car. He knew because he was counting the cracks in the pavement, the way he'd been trained to count everything. Exits. Enemies. Seconds before a situation turned irreversible. This situation had turned irreversible approximately 40 minutes ago. Mateo had smiled at him across the dinner table. He even passed the bread and laughed at something Ricardo's lieutenant said. And somewhere between the second course and the dessert, he had made a phone call that ended with 2 bullets and a body count that should have included Ricardo Rodriguez. Should have. Ricardo pressed his back against the brick wall and tried to breathe like a man who still had reason to. The rain fell straight and indifferent, the way rain always did. It didn't care who you were before the pavement found you. And then, with his eyes closed, he heard the footsteps. He thought it was someone that came to finish him up, so he didn't bother opening his eyes. He wanted it quick and painless. Then, he felt the small and soft hands on his face, and then he opened his eyes. He was in uttermost disbelief with what he saw. A young angel, a young innocent girl, kneeling beside him. He thought, "Go away." He thought it with everything he had left. She didn't. The little girl in the yellow raincoat crouched in front of him like he was a puzzle she'd already decided to solve. 6 years old, maybe. Curls flattened by rain. Eyes so wide and unafraid they felt like an accusation. She pressed her small palm against his cheek. "Don't be scared," she told him softly. "You're safe now. My mommy helps people." Ricardo Rodriguez, who had never once been scared, felt something crack open in the center of his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet. He heard footsteps then. Faster. Adult. A woman rounded the alley entrance and stopped dead. She looked at his face and whispered, barely audible above the rain. "You." Rosa Sanchez had a rule. Never bring danger home. She had built that rule from the wreckage of the last time danger came looking. This happened 3 years ago, on a Tuesday night. A man who loved her bleeding out in a hospital corridor because 2 factions decided a particular street corner was worth more than his life. She had held his hand while the monitors went flat. She had walked out of that hospital, collected Lizzie from her mother's arms, and made herself a promise, so clean it still cut. Never again. And yet, Ricardo Rodriguez was on her kitchen table. She worked without speaking. hands moving through muscle memory she had spent 3 years trying to forget. Trauma nurse. 8 years of it. She had left because the work followed her home, and eventually the home had followed back. She knew who he was. Everyone in this city knew who he was. The name that made landlords suddenly remember available units. The name you did not say near open windows. She also knew, clinically and without sentiment, that he had perhaps 40 minutes before the blood loss made this conversation entirely irrelevant. Lizzie. Her voice didn't shake. She had practiced being unshakable for a long time. Go to your room. Headphones on. But Mommy, he looked scared. Headphones. Please. She waited for the click of the bedroom door. Then she looked at him, really looked, and let herself feel the full weight of what she was choosing. You signed off on the Delgado expansion, she said. Flat.
Certain.
Not a question. Ricardo's jaw tightened. Something shifted behind his eyes. Meridian Street. April. 3 years ago. She pressed the gauze harder than strictly necessary. That was your territory. Your order. The silence that followed was longer than she expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of everything she imagined it usually carried.
Low.
Emptied out. I know. 2 words. And somehow, they were the most dangerous thing he had said all night. Because Rosa had prepared herself for denial. She had not prepared herself for grief. He was still on her couch at midnight when the first car rolled slowly past the window. Rosa saw it from the kitchen. Headlights turned off with engines barely audible. The patience of people who are not lost, who are exactly where they intend to be. Her stomach dropped. She crossed over to the couch in 4 steps. Ricardo was already awake. She suspected that he had never been fully asleep. His eyes found hers the moment she moved. What she saw in them was not confusion. It was calculation. How many exits? He asked. This isn't a safe house. How many exits, Rosa? Her name in his mouth again.
Low.
Deliberate. Like he had been holding it carefully and finally set it down. She pushed past the feeling. Just the front door and the fire escape off the bedroom window. That's it. He was already moving, which should have been impossible given what she had pulled out of him 3 hours ago. He moved like a man who had decided that pain was simply information and not instruction. Wake Lizzie quietly. Shoes on and nothing else. I will not take my daughter into. The front window exploded inward. Rosa was moving before the glass finished falling, toward Lizzie's room, not away from it. Instinct older than fear. Ricardo was behind her instantly, placing himself between her and the hallway. She grabbed Lizzie from the bed. Half asleep, clutching her rabbit, one warm cheek pressed against Rosa's shoulder. She focused on that cheek. On the fire escape railing cold under her palm. What Ricardo did in the hallway, she did not let herself look. Then he was beside her. A cut across his jaw. Eyes completely calm. One escaped, he said. He'll report back. Lizzie lifted her face and studied Ricardo with the gravity only children can produce without effort. Are you scared now? She asked him. Something moved across Ricardo's face that Rosa had no name for. Something that looked terrifyingly like the beginning of honesty. Yeah, Mija, he said quietly. Just a little. Rosa looked at this man, who had unmade her world before she ever learned his name, holding her daughter's gaze like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. And God help her. She believed him. The cabin smelled like cedar and old winters and someone else's better life. Rosa's father had actually built it with his own hands, before the strokes, before the slow, quiet dismantling of the man she remembered. It sat 40 miles outside the city in the kind of silence that city people mistake for peace and country people understand is simply the absence of witnesses. Ricardo stood at the window for a long time, not admiring the tree lines. He was actually mapping it, cataloging the spaces between the pines, the shadows that moved with the wind versus the shadows that didn't, the distance between the cabin door and the nearest natural cover. He did this the way other men check their phones, without deciding to, without being able to stop. Rosa watched him do it and said nothing. Lizzie had claimed the smaller bedroom without asking. She arranged her stuffed rabbit on the pillow with the seriousness of someone establishing a military perimeter, then announced that the rabbit's name was Captain and that Captain was in charge of safety.
Ricardo had said nothing.
But Rosa had seen his jaw move, that small involuntary thing, and filed it away beside everything else she was not yet ready to name. They did not speak easily. They spoke in the careful way of people navigating a room full of breakable things, choosing each step before they took it. "You should eat," she said on the second morning. "I've been shot before." "That isn't what I asked." He looked at her. A long, recalibrating look, the kind that suggested he was not accustomed to sentences that didn't negotiate. Then he sat down and ate without another word. It was Lizzie who undid him. Not through anything dramatic, through the relentless, indifferent ordinary. She asked him to open a jar of peanut butter. She showed him a drawing she had made of the three of them standing in front of the cabin, each figure labeled in her careful 6-year-old print. She fell asleep against his arm during a film he hadn't been watching, and he did not move for 93 minutes. Rosa stood in the doorway and watched his face while Lizzie slept. She had expected discomfort, the stiff tolerance of a man enduring something foreign. Instead, what she saw was far more unsettling, a man trying not to show that he was being changed, holding himself perfectly still so nothing spilled. She turned away before he could catch her watching. Then his phone lit up on the kitchen table. The encrypted one. She had not known about it until that moment. She didn't mean to read it. She read it. For words. Sender unknown. Timestamp 3 minutes ago. "I know about the little girl." Rosa's hand was on Lizzie's bedroom door before the cold had finished moving through her. Behind her, she heard Ricardo say something low and quiet in Spanish that she understood completely. It was not a curse. Neither was it a threat. It was a reckoning. This was the part Ricardo had not allowed himself to look at directly. The way you don't look at a wound until you are ready, because once you have looked, everything that follows is accountable to that moment of seeing. He spread what he had across the kitchen table. Contacts. Access points. 11 years of architecture laid flat in a cabin kitchen at 3 in the morning. Mateo hadn't simply tried to kill him. Mateo had been living inside the walls for 11 months. Patient. Surgical. Turning Ricardo's own infrastructure into a mechanism pointed back at its maker. Safe houses compromised, 3 lieutenants flipped. The private emergency channel Ricardo had built for exactly this kind of crisis. The one that contained, somewhere in its architecture, the coordinates of this cabin had been breached. The Empire was the enemy now. He sat with that for a long time. Outside, rain moved through the pines. Inside, the cabin held its breath. Rosa appeared in the doorway. She had that quality, arriving without announcement, being present before he had decided how to arrange his face. He had noticed it the first night in her kitchen. He noticed it again now.
"Tell me," she said.
"You don't want this information." Ricardo. His name in her mouth. Not a concession this time. Not careful. A command issued by someone who had already decided to receive whatever came next. "Tell me." So he told her. All of it. The breach. The lieutenants. The routes that no longer belonged to him. The infrastructure he had built believing that control and protection were the same thing, and the places where that belief had cracked open and let something monstrous through. He told her about the Varga cartel, about what the word procurement meant in that world, about the offer Mateo had extended on her behalf, hers and Lizzie's, to men who thought of people the way other men thought of inventory. He watched her face while he talked. She did not flinch. Rosa Sanchez had trained herself out of flinching years ago in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday, while her world rearranged itself permanently around a flat monitor line. But her hands, flat on the table, pressed down until her knuckles whitened. Until the table was the only thing keeping her in the room.
"He was going to sell you," Ricardo said.
"You and Lizzie. To send a message to anyone who might consider sheltering me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with the kind of understanding that arrives fully formed and cannot be unfurnished. "So," Rosa said, quietly, no inflection, the voice of a woman who has processed the worst and is already moving toward what comes next. "What do we do?"
"We."
The word arrived between them like something neither had intended to place there. It sat alongside the contacts and the wreckage of an empire, smaller than all of it and heavier than any of it. Ricardo looked at her hands, then at her face, and said the thing he had never once said to anyone who wasn't already compensated to hear it. I don't know yet. 3 words. From a man who had structured 11 years of absolute certainty, who had built an entire life around never not knowing, who had confused the absence of doubt with strength for so long the two had become indistinguishable. Rosa held his gaze. She did not offer comfort, did not fill the silence with reassurance he hadn't earned. She sat with the truth the way she sat with every other true and terrible thing, squarely, without looking away. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Okay, she said. Let's figure it out. 2 words. From another person, in another moment, they would have meant nothing. From Rosa, at this table, at this hour, they meant something Ricardo did not yet have the vocabulary for. But he felt it. Something load-bearing and long calcified, something he had built walls around so many years ago he had forgotten it was there, began, very quietly, to give way. They came on the 4th night. 3 vehicles, no lights, the particular silence of professionals who have done this before and intend to do it again. Ricardo heard them first. He was already moving through the cabin in the dark, hand on Rosa's shoulder before she had fully surfaced from sleep, her name on his lips like something he had been carrying for a while now without examining why. The cellar, he said. Both of you. Now. Ricardo. Rosa. He found her face in the dark, his thumb against her jaw, a fraction of a second, barely a touch. Please. She went. He heard Lizzie ask something sleepy and scared. Heard Rosa say, steady and certain, Captain is already down there. He needs you. He heard the cellar door close. He heard the bolt slide. And then Ricardo Rodriguez was alone with the dark and the incoming, and felt something clarify in him that had not been clear in years. Not rage. Not calculation. Purpose. What happened in the next 18 minutes, the narrator will not describe in full. Not because it was too terrible, though it was, but because violence, when rendered in detail, becomes spectacle. And this is not that kind of story. This is a story about what violence costs. Ricardo took 3 of them in the treeline, 1 in the hallway. He took a hit himself, a blade, his ribs, adding insult to the injury that hadn't fully healed. He drew them away from the cabin the way a wounded animal draws predators from its den, with deliberate exposure, with the weaponized use of his own damage. When it was over, he sat against an oak tree and breathed through the pain with the focused patience of a man accounting for himself. He had protected them. He had also, the thought arrived quietly, endangered them by existing. If he had stayed dead in that alley, if he had simply allowed inevitability to correct itself the way he'd once expected it to, Rosa would be asleep in her apartment. Lizzie's rabbit would be on its proper shelf. 2 lives would be continuing, undisturbed, in their careful constructed safety. The guilt of that was unlike anything a bullet had ever produced. The cellar door opened. Rosa came out first, reading the tree line, reading him. Then Lizzie, still holding Captain, who crossed the wet grass and pressed herself against Ricardo's side with the absolute confidence of someone who had decided he was safe without consulting anyone. Does it hurt? Lizzie asked, looking at his side. Yes, he said. He had stopped lying to her without deciding to. Rosa knelt in front of him. She didn't ask. She pulled back his shirt and began to work, and this time her hands were not careful and clinical and distanced. This time they were something else entirely. He watched her face while she worked. The furrow between her brows. The way her lip pressed inward when she was concentrating. The fact that she had not let herself cry, not once, through any of this, and how that restraint looked less like strength and more like a woman who had cried so much in a prior life that she had simply run out. Rosa, he said. Don't. I need to say it. She looked up, and whatever she saw in his face made her go still. I'm sorry, Ricardo said. For your husband. For the expansion. For the fact that I built something that reaches this far and touches everything and destroys things I never looked at directly. He held her gaze. I'm sorry that it found you. Rosa looked at him for a long time. The woods were quiet. The rain had stopped. Somewhere above them, the clouds were finally breaking. "I know," she said. His own words returned to him. And somehow, from her, they felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The climax is coming. Subscribe. The ending will break you. Will Ricardo burn his empire to keep them safe? Drop your prediction below. Ricardo walked back into the city like a man who had already decided what he was willing to lose. That was the thing no one understood about men like him. The fear wasn't dying. The fear was dying having protected nothing that mattered. Having spent everything on a throne no one wept over when it was empty. He had left Rosa and Lizzie with the only man alive he still trusted completely, a retired soldier named Ernesto who owed Ricardo a debt of the only currency that truly counted a life. Ernesto's daughter. 12 years ago, Ricardo had made one phone call. Some debts compound. The summit was held in a restaurant that had served as neutral ground for 4 decades, the kind of place where the tablecloths were white and the conversations were dark and everyone understood that the food was incidental. Ricardo arrived 7 minutes early. He sat with his back to the wall. He did not touch his water glass. The 5 family heads arrived in sequence, each reading his presence the way predators read an unfamiliar animal, with caution, with calculation, with the particular hunger of those who smelled an opportunity shifting. Mateo arrived last. Of course he did. Entrances were the only kind of power he had ever truly understood. He looked at Ricardo across the room with the face of a man rehearsing grief he did not feel.
"Cousin," he said.
"I thought you were dead." "I know," Ricardo said. "Sit down." What followed was not the confrontation Mateo had prepared for. There was no rage, no drawn weapon, no dramatic accusation that would allow him to perform wounded innocence for an audience. Instead, Ricardo opened a folder. 11 months of correspondence. Wire transfers. 12 conversations with the Varga cartel's procurement arm, a phrase that, in that world, meant exactly what it sounded like. Names. Dates. The specific offer Mateo had extended regarding 2 women he had not yet acquired. Ricardo slid it to the center of the table and let the other 4 read. The room went very quiet, because there were rules even here, especially here. Territory could be taken. Power could shift. Leaders could fall. But there was one commerce that the old families had always collectively refused. Not out of morality. Out of the cold understanding that once that line dissolved, no one's family was safe. No one's daughters. No one's grandchildren. Mateo had offered to cross it, with people under Ricardo's protection. When the eldest of the 5 finally looked up from the folder, he did not look at Ricardo. He looked at Mateo and said simply, "This is yours to resolve, Ricardo. We'll wait outside." The room emptied in under a minute. Mateo and Ricardo sat alone. The tablecloth was still white. The candle between them still burned. And for the first time in his adult life, Mateo Rodriguez had nothing left to perform. "You were going to sell them," Ricardo said. Not an accusation. A fact being laid flat. Mateo's jaw tightened. "You were supposed to be dead." "I know." Ricardo looked at him, at the boy he had once walked to school, at the man that boy had chosen to become. That's the saddest part. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives not when you lose something, but when you finally understand what you built. Ricardo understood it now. He understood it in the silence after the other families left. In the way Mateo's hands had trembled, not with fear of dying, but with the exposure of being seen clearly for the first time. In the weight of the folder on the table between them, which contained, if you read it a certain way, 11 years of consequences Ricardo had authored without ever looking directly at them. "I built the machine," Ricardo said. "I told myself it was protection, that the city needed architecture, that without structure, the violence would be worse and more random and eat everything indiscriminately." He paused. "I was not entirely wrong." Mateo said nothing. He was listening in the way of a man who had no moves left. "But I was not right enough," Ricardo continued. "I built something that could produce you, that fed you and schooled you and handed you a philosophy of power and then acted surprised when you applied it. He looked at his hands on the table. That's on me. It was the most dangerous sentence Ricardo Rodriguez had ever spoken. More dangerous than any threat. More costly than any war. Because it was true, and truth, spoken aloud in the language of men who traded in leverage, was irreversible. So, what now? Mateo asked. Now, Ricardo said, I dismantle the parts of this that can produce another you.
He meant it literally.
Over the following 72 hours, while Mateo was taken into the custody of men who answered to all 5 families equally, Ricardo made calls that cost him in measurable ways. He dissolved the 2 divisions most deeply embedded in coercion. He surfaced names to federal contacts he had cultivated for years as insurance and never expected to use. He redirected 3 revenue streams into infrastructure that would outlast him, that bore no one's name, that could not be weaponized. He did not dismantle everything. He was not naive enough to believe that the city's architecture would hold without someone's hand on the structure. But he broke what needed breaking. He loosened what had been too tight for too long. He reshaped it. And then, only then, he drove to where Rosa and Lizzie were waiting. Ernesto met him at the door with the expression of a man who had seen many things and had opinions about all of them. She hasn't slept, Ernesto said. Neither have I. I know. That's what I'm telling you. Ricardo found her in the kitchen. Of course the kitchen. That was always where Rosa Sanchez processed the world, sitting with both hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you have spent 3 days rehearsing what you intend to feel, and all of it has become irrelevant. Mateo, she asked. Handled. The empire? Restructured. He paused. Some of it is gone. The parts that could have reached you again. Rosa studied him for a long moment. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. So why? Because I looked at Lizzie asleep against my arm, he said, and I understood that I had been building the wrong things for a very long time. Rosa set down the mug. She stood up. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, the same 4 steps she had taken a lifetime ago in another kitchen, and stopped directly in front of him. I'm still angry at you, she said. For my husband. For all of it. That doesn't go away, because you made phone calls. I know, he said. I'm not asking it to. What are you asking? Ricardo looked at her. This woman who had pulled a bullet from him and fed him and sheltered him and looked at him without the performance of fear that everyone else offered, and said the truest thing he had ever said in his life. I don't know yet, but I'd like to figure it out if you'll let me. Rosa held his gaze for a long time. From the hallway, small bare feet appeared at the edge of the doorway. Lizzie, Captain tucked under one arm, watching them both with the solemn gravity of a child who understands more than the adults in the room would prefer. Are you staying? She asked Ricardo. He looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at him. That, Rosa said slowly, is a very good question. He came back 3 weeks later. Alone. No bodyguards flanking the door. No cars idling at the curb. No weight of empire in the hallway. No performance of protection. No currency offered or implied. Just Ricardo Rodriguez, standing on a perfectly ordinary doorstep, holding absolutely nothing. This was, if you understood the man, the most radical thing he had ever done. He had spent 3 weeks doing what he said he would. Not dramatically, quietly, methodically, with the same precision he had once applied to building the thing he was now carefully unmaking. He checked in with Rosa twice. Brief calls. Nothing asked, nothing pressed. He sent no money. He made no promises. He simply reported, like a man who understood he was on probation from his own history, what he had done and what remained. Rosa had listened each time. Said little. Given him nothing to hold on to, which was, he understood, exactly right. He had not earned holding on yet. The door opened before he knocked. Lizzie stood in the gap, still in her pajamas, Captain hanging from one fist, looking up at him with the expression of someone who had been monitoring the window. You came back, she said. Not surprised. Satisfied, the way children are when the world confirms what they already knew. I came back, he said. She stepped aside to let him in with the authority of someone who has decided she is the one keeping the door. Rosa was in the kitchen, Where else? This time standing at the counter with a dish towel over her shoulder and an expression Ricardo could not fully read. Which was new. He could read most people at 40 feet. He had spent 3 weeks thinking about the fact that he could not read her and had arrived at the conclusion that this was not a problem to solve but a thing to sit with.
Hi, she said.
Hi. Not the opening of Titans. Not the language of power and history and all the weight they carried between them. Just two people in a kitchen on a Tuesday, beginning from the very beginning. I ended the war, he said. The Vargas situation has been resolved through the families. No loose ends that point back to you. The 2 divisions I dissolved are gone fully. 3 of the people I surfaced have been processed. He paused. You won't hear my name in connection with anything dangerous again. If you do, it means I failed, and I'll walk away before it reaches you. Rosa studied him. And if I said I needed you to walk away right now, before it starts? He had prepared for this. He had sat with it for 3 weeks, the real answer, not the answer designed to get what he wanted.
Then I would, he said.
And I would mean it. She watched his face carefully. She had learned, in the past weeks, that Ricardo Rodriguez's face was not designed for reading, that he had spent decades building a surface that gave away nothing. But there was a seam, a small one, around the eyes when something cost him. She had noticed it the night in the woods when he apologized. She saw it now. It told her this was the truth. I'm still angry, she said. I want to be clear about that. There are mornings I wake up and I am still so angry I can't breathe. I know. And I'm still, she stopped. Reset. You scare me. Not the way you used to, not the power and the name and all of that. You scare me because I've watched you with my daughter for 2 weeks, and I know what she'll lose if this goes wrong. Ricardo said nothing. He let it land. He did not rush to fix it or soothe it or argue it away. He stood there and received it the way a man receives the weight of something he earned. Rosa took a long breath. I'm not saying yes to anything, she said. I'm not saying no. Not yet. It was the most careful, most honest, most Rosa thing she had ever said. And Ricardo, who had built an empire on the absolute and the certain and the decisive, found that it was enough. More than enough. Lizzie appeared in the doorway with Captain raised like a declaration. Captain says you can stay for breakfast, she announced. Ricardo looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at him. And the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Not yet, but the architecture of one. The suggestion that a smile was possible somewhere in the future if they were careful enough. Tell Captain thank you, Ricardo said. He sat down at the table. He did not sit like a king. He sat like a man. And for Ricardo Rodriguez, that was everything. Don't be scared. You're safe now. The little girl told the Mafia boss. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for the next one. Drop a comment. Did Ricardo deserve his second chance?